Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the core arguments of modern American conservatism. We're breaking down a recent, highly charged conversation with political commentator and historian Victor Davis Hanson. Now, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, getting a grip on how these arguments are built is, well, it's absolutely crucial for navigating today's landscape. Hanson drops a sweeping critique of the modern left here, and we're going to unpack exactly how he structures that worldview, piece by piece. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at redefining modern fascism, then the battle for California, critiques of systemic burdens, global issues and activism, and finally, a new Republican playbook. All right, part one, redefining modern fascism, specifically through institutional control. The source material kicks off heavy, totally reframing one of the most politically charged words out there right now. Hanson opens up with a pretty provocative question. Who are the real fascists? He completely rejects the idea that fascism has to be loud, crude, or obviously authoritarian. Actually, scratch that. He argues it's the exact opposite today. He claims modern fascism is suave, polished, and empathetic on the surface. It's done in the name of safety or equity, which he argues basically acts as a mask for a much deeper institutional authoritarianism. He totally redefines the term. For Hanson, the real hallmark of a dictatorship is controlling a society's cultural pillars. We're talking K-12 education, NPR, network news, the whole media landscape. He claims these aren't neutral spaces anymore, but basically subsidized liberal monopolies that aggressively suppress conservative viewpoints to control the narrative. It's like a total capture of the institutions. In building on that idea of cultural control, he points to structural control. The source lists specific systemic changes that Democrats allegedly want to enact. Things like abolishing the Electoral College, eliminating the legislative filibuster, and packing the Supreme Court. Hanson frames these not just as, aggressive policy shifts, but as literal subversions of American tradition, designed to permanently rewrite the rules and lock in long-term political dominance. To really cement this idea of institutional weaponization, Hanson lays out a highly specific timeline of what he calls lawfare. Just look at the sequence. Just 3 days after Donald Trump announced his 2024 run, there's this absolute flurry of legal actions on the exact same day. Letitia James visits the White House, Jack Smith is appointed as special counsel, and Matthew Colangelo steps down from the DOJ to work for Alvin Bragg. To put it simply, Hanson sees this as definitive proof of a centrally coordinated effort to take out political opposition. Moving on to Section 2, the battle for California, focusing on governance and policy. We're shifting gears from national theory down to local governance, zooming in on Hanson's home state, particularly Los Angeles. Hanson looks at local Democratic leaders, specifically LA Mayor Karen Bass, and sees a fundamental failure of ideology. His claim? Instead of fixing tangible, on-the-ground problems, like maintaining reservoirs or tackling the massive homelessness crisis, city leadership goes for performative policies. He argues they rely on pricey consultants and rigid diversity, equity, and inclusion hiring practices that, in his view, prioritize ideological alignment over actually knowing how to run a major city. To really drive this home, Hanson shares a micro-story about a 15,000-acre fire on Santa Rosa Island. He recounts how the government took this land from private ranchers for preservation, but then the grazing animals that naturally cleared the brush were removed. So, without those animals managing the fuel, boom, the island suffers a massive, devastating fire. He uses this chain of events to argue that ideological environmental management can literally destroy the very things it's trying to protect. All right, Section 3, critiques of systemic burdens, looking at healthcare and welfare. The conversation pivots here using a really fascinating rhetorical technique to make some massive policy claims. It's super important to understand exactly how Hanson builds his arguments here. He relies heavily on what we can call an anecdote-to-argument bridge. Basically, he takes highly personal, everyday encounters, sitting in a hospital waiting room or standing in line at the grocery store, and scales them up to diagnose huge, complex national issues like immigration and the economy. Take this, for example. While talking about his own recent, super expensive surgery bills, Hanson pivots to the entire U.S. healthcare system. Pointing out that 1 in 4 hospital patients in California has diabetes, he argues the whole system is going bankrupt. He claims this immense financial strain comes from a shrinking, aging domestic population combined with an influx of undocumented immigrants who need extensive care for chronic conditions. And he argues this burden lands squarely on border states like California, pushing the safety net to the absolute brink.
He also pushes back really hard against the idea that the American welfare system is stingy. He tells a story about a trip to the grocery store where he watched a shopper use an EBT card to buy processed foods, then pull out cash for alcohol and lottery tickets at the same register before driving off in a leased luxury SUV. He uses this specific encounter to argue that the welfare state is actually completely exploited, way too generous, and desperately missing the basic audits needed to stop systemic abuse.
Let's jump into Section 4, Global Issues and Activism, exploring ideological cross-pollination. The explainer's panning out now to look at international relations and how intertwined domestic activist groups are. The source highlights a recent event where the U.S. indicted Raul Castro. According to the hosts, the second that happened, a staggering 145 domestic nonprofits and activist groups instantly mobilized to defend the Cuban government. For Hanson, this incredibly fast, seamlessly coordinated response is proof. He argues it shows deep, cross-pollinated Marxist ties within the modern American left, suggesting they're basically operating on a unified global agenda. Now, regarding foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, the source calls for a highly aggressive, absolutely uncompromising stance. The argument is that foreign adversaries just do not respect traditional rules of engagement. So Hanson insists the U.S. has to stop negotiating from a perceived position of weakness. He even argues that religious holidays like Ramadan or the Hajj absolutely shouldn't stop the military from taking decisive, immediate action if provoked. Which brings us to Section 5, a new Republican playbook covering strategy and tactics. Here, the conversation completely pivots from critiquing the left to offering an actionable strategy for the right to combat the institutional control they've been talking about. The hosts enthusiastically back a 6-point plan from Newt Gingrich. It's laid out as a highly practical roadmap. We're talking tangible economic relief, like aggressively driving down global gas prices and projecting strength by keeping the Straits of Hormuz open. It also leans into public health through the Make America Healthy Again movement. The big picture? Blueprinting the next 2 years of a GOP Congress, all while constantly highlighting the most extreme examples of Democratic policy to win over skeptical voters. Ultimately, Hanson is calling for a massive tactical shift. He argues Republicans need to totally ditch the Marquess of Queensberry rules. You know, that polite, aristocratic, very traditional style of politicians like Mitt Romney or John McCain, who Hanson claims would rather lose nobly than get their hands dirty. Instead, he is all in on the MAGA approach, aggressive, relentless, and focused on winning by any means necessary, basically operating on the assumption that the other side has already tossed the old rulebook out the window. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final structural question to think about based on the worldview we just covered. If both sides of the political spectrum increasingly believe that saving the nation means completely abandoning traditional rules in favor of total institutional control and aggressive, uncompromising tactics, do these strategies actually preserve the republic, or do they fundamentally change it into the exact thing they claim to be fighting? It's definitely something to chew on as you navigate today's rapidly shifting political landscape. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating material, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.